if you really want to get rid of Iran's nuclear weapons capability, really now's the time to do it. And to Donald Trump's credit, he hasn't taken military action off the table. Imagine if you had a strongly Christian identifying country that was threatening to wipe Islamic states off the map of the world. These people at universities and in our elite culture would be completely outraged. They wouldn't want this state to exist at all, certainly not to have nuclear weapons. Our foreign policy has become very performative. It's performative because it's all about the appearance of competence and doing what it is we're meant to do without thinking about what is the outcome that we need to get to. From the Americans' point of view, the worst of all worlds is that they don't have enough submarines. The Australians aren't spending enough in cannibalising our own existing forces. We're not building facilities we need to actually operate and maintain the submarines that we want to buy from the Americans. And we're weaker in 5 years than we will be now because we're not spending enough money on defence. So let's say China gets Taiwan. If China now says to Australia, we want to pay half the market price in iron ore, what's to stop them from imposing that? If China now says we want to buy that port or that farm or that mine or that technology, there is nothing that can actually stop the Chinese from actually doing that.
Well, Dr. John Lee is a long-time friend and associate, and we've spoken to him before. He's a professor and senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, non-resident fellow. He's also a senior fellow at the United States Study Centre and adjunct professor at the University of Sydney. His articles have been published in leading policy and academic journals in America, in Asia, and Australia. Well, John, thank you so much for joining us again. I have known you now for a very long time, and your wife, Lavina, and I think of you as champion Australians, championing Australia very well at a critical time. So it's a great pleasure to have you again.
Well, thank you, John. I'm always happy to share my wife's reflected glory. But this is a podcast I've been on before, and I listen to it all the time, so I'm really happy to go on again.
Well, thanks. And the point about this, and as quickly as we'll turn around, we'll get it out there. This is a critical time, I suspect, for global stability. As we sit here now, the President of the United States has said that he will decide within 2 weeks whether to become directly engaged in the Middle East in essentially a war between Israel and Iran. The impact of Americans becoming involved in the Middle East has not been an overwhelmingly positive story over the last 50 years. As Jared Baker's pointed out in the Wall Street Journal, he needs to think very carefully. And yet I suspect I wouldn't be putting words in your mouth if I said you and I are probably both rather hoping that nuclear capacity in Iran is wiped off for now.
Well, you can say a lot of things about Donald Trump, but the one thing he has been on Iran, he has been very clear morally and on policy. And it has been very simple. Iran is not allowed to get a nuclear weapon. Now, the fortunate thing for the Americans, if they do intervene in Iran over the next couple of weeks, is that Israel has done the hard work for the Americans. Israel has taken out the proxies of Iran, the Houthis, or at least weakened the Houthis, Hamas, Hezbollah. Syria is gone, the old Syria. So Iran is fairly isolated. You're not seeing a lot of championing of Iran by China and Russia right now. And Iran militarily is on its knees. So if you really want to get rid of Iran's nuclear weapons capability, really now's the time to do it. And to Donald Trump's credit, he hasn't taken military action off the table. It looks like it will need American military action to decisively take the Iran bomb off the table.
Well, as we look at this, the president said, 2 weeks, that he'll make a decision. Is he forlorn in his hope that they might come back to the negotiating table? Or do you think their stubborn resistance, something we just can't understand in the West, their ideas around martyrdom and dying for Allah, paying whatever price, will drive them to behave irrationally? What do you predict? I
can't see the Ayatollah giving up his nuclear program. Because if he does that, he loses power. And if he doesn't just lose power, he may actually lose his life. There could actually be either an internal revolution or a countrywide coup against his government and that system. So for people who put themselves in this position for that long, they really can't back down. Saddam Hussein couldn't do it. The Ayatollah can't do it. I don't think Xi Jinping could do it. So what that means is my gut feeling is that Trump's hope that the Iranians somehow give up their nuclear program, which would mean the Americans don't really have to enter the war. I don't think that's likely to happen. Now, if the Americans don't enter the war, it's probably because the Americans flinched at the last moment and decided not to enter the war. But I don't think it's because the Ayatollah is giving up his nuclear program, which is Trump's. Trump has mentioned that is the condition upon which negotiations and peace has to occur.
Interesting that the isolationists in America are now saying, you told us you'd stay out of these things. You've got to do that. 53% of his supporters say, no, stay out, I understand. But he said, hey, listen, it was me who invented the term America First, so therefore I'll determine what America First means. It's hard for me to imagine if they don't give up and come back to the negotiating table in a serious way that he won't press the button, because he's the sort of guy who is just unlikely to accept that sort of compromise.
Yeah, I mean, Trump has been very clear, not just in recent times, but really for the last 10 years. Iran cannot have a nuclear bomb. Iran cannot have a nuclear bomb. Now, there could be the scenario where he intentionally deceives himself to say, we haven't taken out the nuclear facilities, but they won't have a nuclear bomb. But if he does that, I think that would be a wasted opportunity, a profoundly wasted opportunity to really fix this issue of the Iran and the nuclear weapons problem. But I also think that if Trump doesn't actually follow through, it has negative cascading effects that China will be reading into Trump's threats. Russia will be reading into it. I think it would severely diminish his standing as a strongman if Trump doesn't follow through or allows Iran to retain some level of nuclear weapons production. So, there's a lot of pressure on Trump now, too, to follow through. It's not just the pressure on the Iranians or the Israelis. Trump has been admiringly, very admirably, very clear about what has to happen. Iran cannot have a nuclear bomb.
Anthony Ross, a great English historian and writer, has said this is his Churchill moment, when Churchill had to decide whether to destroy the French naval force that was anchored in North Africa, lest it fall into German hands. And he went ahead and did it, and described it just prior to the Battle of Britain as one of the most difficult moments of his life. Is this of that level of magnitude for President Trump, to press the button on something as serious as a rogue state obtaining a nuclear weapon? And what will it mean for global stability in your view?
In my view, it's not from the point of view that Iran isn't the same threat to the globe that Germany was, for example. But Iran getting a nuclear weapon would completely change the shape of the Middle East, would destabilize the Middle East. And if Donald Trump wants a foreign policy or strategic policy success, as I argue, I think the Israelis have laid it out on a platter for him. If Donald Trump can take out that Iranian nuclear processing site, then that would be not just a success for the Trump administration, but it would change the Middle East for the better. That would be a very good way for the Trump administration to begin its first year in office.
Lots of things to consider there. One of them is that most of the surrounding Arab states are presumably sitting back hoping that Iran is pulled into line.
I think this is the thing, that this would not be an unpopular decision. Now, I know the Saudis and the Jordanians and the rest, I know they can't talk too loudly or cheer on the Americans, But their number one threat, and it's a real threat, it's not imagined, is Iran. And their number one nightmare is a nuclear-armed Iran. So even putting aside the Israeli angle, the Saudis and the other Arab states would be hoping and wishing that the nuclear facilities of the Iranians are decisively taken out, and only the Americans can do that.
Talking to a friend the other day whose daughter is it one of Australia's universities, and she said that her friends were all saying, well, this is serious, by the way. They said to her, she's a reliable witness, well, Israel has nuclear weapons. Why shouldn't Iran have nuclear weapons?
The fundamental difference is that Israel doesn't threaten to wipe out another country. Iran not only threatens it, it's in the constitution of Islamic Republic government that their goal is the elimination of Israel. They don't mean the political elimination. They mean the physical, existential elimination of Israel. And regardless of where you sit on the Jewish question or the state of Israel, Israel is a legitimate state. It's recognized as such. If you have a neighboring country or a country that's close enough to you, credibly threatening to wipe you off the map, and that is the foreign policy platform of the people in power in Iran right now, what would you do?
What would we do if we had a neighbor right next to us, specifically developing a nuclear war capacity to wipe us out?
I think that there's just a failure or a refusal to make judgments about different governments. The character of Israeli government is fundamentally different to the character of the government of the Islamic Republic in terms of what they want to achieve, how they want to achieve it, what the end state is. So Israel having a weapon of mass destruction is not inherently destabilizing. In fact, most of the Arab states welcome it secretly or clandestinely. Iran having a nuclear weapon is fundamentally threatening and destabilizing the entire region.
Of course, the question itself, and I can sit here certainly and say it's been asked by some young Australians, reveals, I think, a great deal of a lack of a sophisticated understanding. For a start, in a determinatively secular, insistence on moral equivalence and all cultures are equal and so forth, we've lost the capacity, even the language, to understand Islamic fundamentalism, extremism, the way in which profound religious belief can drive people to extraordinary lengths.
There is something strange about the Western society, modern Western society, particularly Anglo-Saxon Western society, because imagine if you had a strongly Christian identifying country that was threatening to wipe Islamic states off the map of the world. These people at universities and in our elite culture would be completely outraged. They wouldn't want this state to exist at all, certainly not to have nuclear weapons. But if an Islamic state promises the same thing, to wipe a Jewish state off the map, somehow that is just inherently not as threatening as if a Christian state did that. To me, that says something, very, it says something about the way Western society has gone, the loathing of Western society, that they refuse to criticize other cultures or other religions for their stated goals, which are fundamentally opposed to this whole secular notion of live and let live. I don't really understand it. It could be a lack of perspective. It could be a lack of history, or it could be something worse about the direction of Western culture. I'm not sure, but it is something that is inconsistent, and I can't explain it.
We're hoping to explore these very issues in the next AUKUS conference in Australia, by the way. Why won't we be more honest and inform ourselves more accurately? We're talking here about a liberal democracy, a sort of country that most Australians would be comfortable living in, versus one, for example, where no Australian woman would want to live, in Iran. They're so completely different. Why, then, do we allow our government, because this is what they're doing, to essentially completely misread the situation and sideline themselves. They're becoming embarrassingly irrelevant on the international stage in relation to the Middle East because they've not recognized Israel's genuine and existential struggle for existence as a democratic state, and they've not recognized properly, in my view, what they're up against. So you hear these ridiculously irrelevant statements about de-escalation when it's too late for that. You hear the insistence on a two-state solution when it's impossible until Iran and its proxies agree, and they're nowhere near agreeing. So we're making ourselves irrelevant, even a laughingstock, by being utterly unrealistic.
This current Labor government that I'm talking about, they remind me a lot of my time in student politics. And what I mean is they view the world in terms of the colonizers and the colonized, the rich and the poor. If you are the poor, you're a victim. If you're rich, you're not. They see Israel as a rich Western state. And by the way, it's not really Western. And they see the Israelis as colonizers because they don't know the history about how Israel was formed. They were not the colonizers. But because they've got this framework, regardless of what led to October 7th and beyond, what has led to what's going on now with Iran and Israel, they've got that inherent a priori bias that they do not want to be on the side of so-called colonizers and the wealthy West. And it's a very undergraduate position. Now, that's all fine if you're in university. It's not fine when you're running the country and the foreign policy of the country. So I would say that when it comes to these issues that are now defining our time in history, right from October 7th onwards, Israel, Palestine, Israel, Iran, big changes are happening, and our current government is either not picking it up, is either opposing the sorts of changes that would make the world safer, or, as you say, simply just becoming irrelevant.
It's sort of ideology-driven rather than pragmatic and understanding-driven.
There's something good and bad about Australia being where it is geographically. We can look at the world, we can pontificate. Nothing seems real. Threats don't really seem particularly real. So when Israel says we are facing an existential threat, I don't think that resonates with this government, and I don't think it resonates with a lot of Australians as well. A lot of it has to do with our geography. The strategic arguments and discussions we have, it almost seems abstract and intellectual and optional, as opposed to something which will fundamentally change how the world is governed, how people's lives are lived, how power's distributed. There is an abstraction about the conversation that's going on in Australia, including by the current Labor government.
The reality surely is that the Israelis have actually done an incredible job. You have to admire their proficiency. They really have massively weakened Iran militarily, and that opens the way now to remove their capacity to move to nuclear armament. And we ought to be recognizing that. Realpolitik would say the world is going to be more stable, frankly, if the Israelis have their way. But we can't bring ourselves to admit it because we don't like the Israelis.
Well, the Israelis recognize the brutal reality and importance of hard power. And they recognize it because if they don't have it, they will be wiped off the map. Like that's as direct and as brutal as it gets. Now, Benjamin Netanyahu, I know he's a very divisive figure within Israel and outside Israel, but the one thing you can say about him that since October the 7th, he has been courageous and he has had strategic clarity. The courage is obvious. The strategic clarity is just identify where the threats come from, and if it's within our power, let's eliminate them. It's simple, but it's powerful. And I note as well that Donald Trump has sort of been led on. No, that's not the right word. Donald Trump has now has become very enthusiastic about Israel and Netanyahu government because he sees an opportunity that this is the government, the Israeli Netanyahu government, that has created the conditions to make some real permanent changes in international politics of the Middle East that will suit both Israel and the United States. Look, this is a pivotal moment for that important part of the world. And it is a shame, and it's somewhat of an embarrassment that Australians are not part of that conversation.
Just back for a moment to this idea that Israel's evil because it's a colonizer. The concept of colonization in its moral dimension has to do with dispossession. Has there ever been a race that have been more dispossessed more often and more unfairly than the Jewish people, who have just one state now? Every other culture has many states. There's just one Jewish state. And guess which one everyone wants to get rid of? It's them. I would argue that we actually, if we were really thinking humanely, would recognize the massive unfairness that's been visited on the Jewish people simply because they're Jewish, down through the ages, including most horrifically last century.
The Palestinian entities, whether you're talking about Hamas or the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, they're not as strong as Israel, obviously, in a hard power way, but one way they've been very effective is they have been very effective at defining a narrative. And the narrative they define is that Jews never existed in the Middle East. We know that to be absurd if you know any history, if you know your Bible, which is a historical document. But how often do you hear this notion that the Jews have thrown Palestinians and Arabs out of the Middle East?
It's the other way around.
It's the other way around. The Jews were all around the Middle East. In fact, they've been driven out of everywhere in the Middle East except for Israel. They've had a permanent association with where they are for 4,000 plus years. They're just the historical facts, but that's not the narrative that comes out. So somehow they're positioned as the colonizers, the occupiers. Look, I normally don't like to use blanket terms like anti-Semitism, but the analysis applied to Israel and the Jewish people is different to analysis applied to any other people that I know about. And I can only call it anti-Semitic. That is what it is. But it's fueled by these false narratives that have been very successful. They're also being spread, developed, propagated, unfortunately, by our sort of intellectual class, by our academics, who say very similar things and are not, no one really will contest it with them. And finally, I would say in the Australian context, it hasn't been helped by the current government. Now, I remember when October 7th happened, the first thing our Foreign Minister Penny Wall said was to call for Israeli restraint and de-escalation. Imagine if a group of people... Proportionality.
So what do? You go out and you slaughter 1,250 women, children, and you imprison and kidnap. That's proportionality, mate.
And then proceeded to talk about rushing through a two-state solution, a recognition of Palestine after what's happened. The point I'm making is that the government does have some say. When the protests against the memorial or against the event at the Opera House on October the 8th or 9th, whatever it was, honouring the murdered Jews, when there was that massive protest, the government, both state and federal, did nothing. That, I think, set the scene for the sorts of public discussion. So I do think the current government has a lot to answer for on this particular issue.
Before we move back to Australia and our position in all of this, as I say, I think we're making ourselves largely irrelevant. But it does strike me, too, that we're not thinking clearly about our own hypocrisy here. Thinking people would never say, I've got it in for the Germans because they had a Nazi government at one stage. We're just glad they're free of it and we're free of it. Thinking people don't equate Chinese people with a communist regime, communism being a bastard offshoot really out of European thinking, not Asian thinking, in all of its ugliness. But somehow or other, they seem to think it's all right to say, I'm not anti-Semitic, but I'm anti-Israel, in a way that makes you kind of suspect They really are driven by
Well,
anti-Semitism.
in this case, I don't think there can be a distinction, because if you don't think that the Jewish people ought to have a homeland that has been recognized by the United Nations, recognized by most countries around the world, the overwhelming number of countries around the world, then not only do you have something against the state of Israel, you have something against Jewish people and Jewish self-determinism. And so we can call it anti-Semitism. They may choose to call it something else, but by any definition, it's basically anti-Semitism. So anti-Zionism, in this case, equates anti-Semitism, because you're saying the Jewish people do not have a right to self-determination, and therefore their state is fundamentally illegitimate. I don't think you can just separate the two.
And it's struck me the other day that Khomeini, the leader of Iran, said, no, we don't seek to obliterate the Jews. We just seek to get rid of Israel because that region should be controlled by Palestinians. It immediately raises the question, so you would like the Jewish people who are left there to live like the people in Gaza? What's my point? Really? We want to be associated with that idea? Get rid of Israel, a successful democracy with high living standards, where people of a diversity of views can live in peace with one another, where they actually employ people and even have people from other racial groups in their parliaments, for heaven's sake, contrasted with the mess that is Gaza. A failed Islamic model of a state, if ever there was one. It could be a Singapore. It could be an Israel. It could be a great place to live. But no, it's more important to get rid of it and subject the Jews to that sort of lifestyle. There's many of those academics that you're talking about, particularly females, ought to stop and think about. Do you think the people of Iran would want that visited on others? Really? They'd want others to live like they live? Look how women are subjugated in Iran. But there's no honesty around any of this.
Well, when you have an all-encompassing narrative of colonizers versus the colonized, victims versus oppressors, the facts don't really matter. And you don't feel the effects of it. If you're a female, whatever your sexual orientation or whatever the case may be, you're not in Iran. You're not in Gaza under Hamas. You don't know or care what it actually means, what kind of institutions and values they have. You can just have your narrative and march accordingly and hold the flag of Hamas or Palestine or whatever it is that you want to hold. I don't know what you call that, hypocrisy maybe, but I actually call it heartlessness. You don't actually care about what happens to people in that society, even those people with identities that you yourself associate with. Yeah. That is not just hypocrisy. To me, that is actually heartlessness.
That's an interesting perspective and hard to argue with. Now, back to something that you said, to change gears here. President Trump is, as far as we can work out, pretty transactional. And he likes a winner. He likes people to step up. So he's seeing that the Israelis have stepped up, and they presented him with the opportunity at probably relatively light cost, never likely to be lighter, to strike a decisive blow, even though many in his own party are saying, don't get involved in another foreign conflict, even though all the evidence suggests it'll make the world a safer place. Australia hardly looks like we're stepping up at the moment, John. I mean, what have we got to say to President Trump? Hey, listen, we're a good ally. We can help. We can make a difference globally in a dangerous time.
This is where I think the Labor government's sort of got things the wrong way around. There's all these kerfuffle at the moment is Albanese can't get a meeting with Trump. Will he get a meeting with Trump? What if he does get a meeting with Trump? What's he going to say if Trump says, why aren't you spending more on defense? Why do you have the Middle East or Israel policy that you have? Albanese won't have an answer. So the point I'm trying to make is it's not about better diplomacy or Kevin Rudd pushing harder to organise a meeting for Albanese and Trump. It's that the Australian policies that we have right now are not the ones that are either going to be agreed to by the United States or, in my view, ones that actually help the world solve some of the problems that other countries are assisting with. So for Australia, it's our foreign policy has become very performative. We judge ourselves on, did we get a head of government meeting with the Americans? How many meetings with the Chinese have we had? It's performative because it's all about the appearance of competence and doing what it is we're meant to do without thinking about what is the outcome that we need to get to. And as a country, what sort of resources and policies do we need to get to that outcome? It's a very frustrating thing to watch as an Australian citizen, all of this.
I agree. I deeply and profoundly agree. For every reason, including the fact that I'm now a father and a grandfather, I want this country to be like the one that gave me so many opportunities and let me live in peace and security and not wondering whether or not I'd be safe tomorrow. And here we are, we punched above our weight, way above our weight in the First World War, arguably in the Second World War. We've been a serious mid-sized nation. And now it's as though we want to curl up into a little ball and pretend that the real world's not out there in defiance of everything our forebears have done for us, but in a way that, frankly, I think is making me feel distinctly less safe.
Well, the world as we knew it for the last 4 or 5 decades is unraveling.
Yep.
And one of the false assessments, I think, that many in this government, but also many of our intellectual elite make, one of the false assessments is that the world is unraveling because of Donald Trump.
Yeah.
No, it's not. Donald Trump is responding to some of the problems for the United States caused by an unraveling system that we've had over the last 40 or 50 years. Now, Trump doesn't have all the answers, but the point is, if you're an Australian government, the Australian Prime Minister, your duty is to think about how to proactively position Australia, how to proactively utilize the relationships and alliances we have to do the best for ourselves in this world and to create or at least change structures in the world that are going to be better for Australian interests. The current government doesn't do that. The current government just wants to manage each bilateral relationship. So the Chinese will stabilize things, but we won't really confront the differences that we have, which is substantial. With the Americans, we will do the minimum that Trump demands that we do.
But we're not doing the minimum.
Well, that we're trying to get away with it. That's the point. I mean, I have a sneaking suspicion, actually, Albanese is probably not that keen to meet Trump because he doesn't really want the president saying you must spend at least 3% of GDP. The current government would rather be in a passive crouch position and hope all this passes by and Australia continues on its happy way. But the world doesn't really work like that. And I don't think Australians or this government can imagine a situation where things actually get bad for us. But, the course of international politics, human history is not always a sort of happily upward, harmonious one. And I just don't think as a country, as a government, we're thinking about these sorts of things.
The point really that you're mounting is that as a mid-sized nation, and all the American surveys show that the Australians are the people that the Americans most like and respect and identify with. We've got massive goodwill. But rather than engaging in a way that would see us accept our role as genuinely responsible international citizens, to inject ourselves as a way that we've done in so many times in the past, where we've punched above our weight because we've been respected. We've put perspectives and we've been seen to pull our weight that have been a great force for good in the world. At the moment, we're actually running away, as I see it, from our responsibilities, not just to ourselves, but to global harmony.
The way I would frame it is that I think the current government is acting like we're a much smaller nation.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about it, Australia is the 12th largest economy in the world. So we are... For now. But the point being that we are, one of the few advanced economies in the world. We're the 12th largest economy in the world. we have substantial material resources to help shape the world. And we are also the allies of the most powerful countries in the world. So we have those levers that we want to pull, but the way we're currently trending at the moment, we're sort of acting like a small, I don't mean this in a derogative way, but we're acting like a small Southeast Asian nation where we just try to shield ourselves from what's happening around the world, actually taking a proactive shaping mindset to the world. And that's not what Australia has done in the last 50, 70 years. But at the moment, it is what Australia is doing.
Think of the Australian great leaders, the Deakinses of this world, the Chifleys, I suppose you could say, the Curtins, the Menzies, the Howards, the Hawkes. Do you think any of them would have not been more ambitious for Australia?
Well, governance in Australia now, or leading the nation of Australia now, has become more of a managerial type of activity rather than a statesman-like one. You know, the statesman-like one being what are our strengths, what are our weaknesses, what are our opportunities, what are our threats, and how do we manage and negotiate those. A managerial one is really just sort of managing bilateral relationships, doing the minimal, not sticking our heads up and hoping everything gets better around us. Right? I think that's where we're at. And in fact, on domestic policy as well, I think that's also where we're at. That the benefits of the time of the Hawke Keating government, of the time of the Howard Anderson government, when you're in government, we are nearing the end of those benefits.
Yeah.
And it needs to be a domestic renewal of policies, which really hasn't happened. I don't think the conversation has even happened.
There's been a lack of, a real dearth of leadership. The last major change in public policy in Australia was the introduction of a new tax system and the GST. It's over 25 years ago.
There's just been a very, the whole mindset is redistribution. And, you know, I don't give great marks, by the way, to recent conservative governments either.
No.
They haven't fought the fight. I don't think they're as bad as Labor governments. They haven't fought the fight. But the point is that a reform is seen as redistribution. It is not seen as how to grow the pie, how to become more productive, how to push our nation forward. It's all about redistribution. And maybe that's the upshot of, 30 plus years of economic growth off the back of selling minerals and commodities. But there is a reckoning, and I think it is clearly happening now.
So we're sitting here now. The world looks like a very dangerous place. Our government apparently can't even see and comprehend and articulate that reducing Iran's capacity to wage war will make the world a safer place. And we're insisting that 2% of GDP on defence is all we need to do, hiding the reality that as you and I sit here now, our defence capability is in decline. We are less powerful now than we were a few years ago. And we will continue to decline in effectiveness for some years. It's complete balderdash to try and imply that we put another 10 billion in and that's going to make a difference. Our capability right now is increasingly irrelevant and increasingly less reassuring. That's the reality, isn't it?
Yeah, but I think that's happened because the current government that we have isn't thinking about what are the threats and what kind of capabilities do we need and what contributions ought we to make to collective efforts. It's thinking more about what can we get away with. So how much do we need to spend to keep AUKUS on the books, even if we don't produce any submarines or weapons? How do we manage American expectations or lower American expectations and get by? So it's not talking about, how do we actually protect ourselves, which is what defense policy ought to be. It is just how do we manage external expectations and keep current or pre-existing agreements like AUKUS on the books, right? So it's fundamentally almost a sort of policy or political game for them. It's not so much about what Australia needs to or ought to do as a nation in the defence space.
Now, we celebrate every Anzac Day and at other times when we stop to think about it, the reality that we stand on the shoulders of very brave people who stood up. Their legacy, in other words, makes them heroes. And in the context of what you've just said, those who are in the thick of government at the moment will be worried as their political careers come to something of an end about their legacy. Do you think they're stopping to think about how trashed their legacy will be, how loathed they will be by future Australians if something goes wrong and they'd have ignored all the warnings and all the expert advice, because it is everywhere at the moment, including from former greats from the Labor Party like Kim Beazley, that we need to do more. Their own defence reviews, everything's showing it. They talk about these being the most dangerous times since the 1930s. What do they think their legacy will look like if something does go wrong? And there's a pretty high chance, a frighteningly high chance of it.
I think the lack of action, the lack of resources, you've got to ask the question, all of these assessments their own government are putting out, do they really believe it? Do they actually go to bed thinking this is a real problem for our country? Or is it performative? Is it that, yes, we recognise the expert views and we put it in our documents and that's enough? That's what governments do. They have good policies on paper. They don't actually make sacrifices and take opportunity costs and risks to manage those sorts of assessments. So you've got to ask, are they actually worried about the things their own assessments say they ought to be worried about? Or are they really just interested in getting past the next 1 or 2 year electoral cycle? I'm not quite sure, but you've got to ask, where are they from a headspace point of view?
And the Deputy Prime Minister, my successor in that role, says, I agree with him, by the way, and would have then, and I still do. The primary responsibility of the federal government is the safety and security of Australian people. That's what it is. Just as it is in Israel. That's the prime responsibility.
Look, the problem for our Deputy Prime Minister and our Defence Minister is that I think he's probably the most serious of the lot when it comes to these sorts of issues. But he seems to be losing the argument around the cabinet table when it comes to resourcing and priorities. So if you look at the first term of the Albanese government, to my knowledge, defence is the only major portfolio that didn't get significant increases.
Borrowed money, by the way.
Borrowed money. But everything else did.
Right.
Now, I'm not inside government at the moment. I'm not around a cabinet table, so I don't really know how to allocate blame in the situation. But as a government, as you know, you've been at highest levels of government, where you allocate resources and where you take risks tells you where you really are in terms of policy headspace. And this government is not in the defence, national security policy headspace because they don't take any risks or allocate sufficient resources that way.
When we were in government, you may recall, and I was on the budget committee, the expenditure review committee as it was known, we actually cut every single department's budgets, every single one of them. We cut every single program to stop the intergenerational theft, except defence.
Yeah.
And that was at a time when there was no apparent threat on the horizon, none. But we maintained expansion.
And actually, as a relevant tangential point, you contrast that with the second-term Trump administration. He forms Dodge, gets Elon Musk to slice money off various spending, but defence budget was immune to Elon Musk's scalpel or sledgehammer. So what that actually tells you is that for whatever you think about someone like Donald Trump, he actually does take national security and defence seriously, which actually belies his idea that he's isolationist. I don't think he's isolationist. He wants a very powerful military. Isolationist, you wouldn't care about defence spending. But that's a huge contrast to the so-called far more outward-looking government of Anthony Albanese.
What do you think then we can make of the review of AUKUS that the Pentagon's now underway? We understand, I think, with the imprimatur of the president, And of course, a lot of the pressure on Albanese, as it's being painted, as you say, a lot of it's about theatre, but you've got to secure AUKUS. You've got to secure AUKUS. Do you see it as at risk, particularly in the context of a lot of American senior people saying, well, we love Australia, but we can't build enough for ourselves?
It is at risk, and this is why. Bridge Colby, who I know well, is leading this review into AUKUS, and the review wasn't set up primarily to spite Australia. It's less so about Australia, initially at least anyway. But this is how these guys think about defense issues and AUKUS. The number one issue is deterring China for them. They're steadily serious about it, particularly over invasion of Taiwan. So what they're looking at is the military balance in Taiwan between the Chinese and the US and allies. Now, the way they look at it is that if the US cannot produce enough submarines to meet what they believe to be their own needs of deterring or defeating the Chinese, then it doesn't make sense for them to sell 3 submarines or 5 submarines to the Australians. Now, this doesn't mean Australia can just passively sit by and wait for this review, because what we do now will shape how this review comes out, because the other questions they're asking is, okay, ideally the United States should just build more of its own submarines, but that's not going to happen overnight. So they'll ask questions like, okay, to what extent is Australia filling the gap? Okay, we can't build submarines right now, but to what extent Australia fast-tracking resourcing to build submarine bases, submarine maintenance facilities in Western Australia, for example? And we're not fast-tracking resources to do that. To what extent is Australia at the political level prepared to commit to contingencies using what resources we have? And to what extent is Australia continuing to fund and improve its existing forces, which may be needed in the next 5 years, rather than cannibalize these to build the submarines that we'll get, or to buy the submarines that we'll get in the 2030s? So the bottom line is, and I've used this word very deliberately, the AUKUS review is about an audit of not just American capability, but Australian capability, intention.
Oh dear.
And we will be found wanting. So I don't expect to see the AUKUS agreement as a whole, which is the military technology sharing agreement, annulled. But I do believe that AUKUS Pillar 1 is at risk. There is no issue of AUKUS Pillar 2, the joint production of asymmetrical weapons and so on. But AUKUS Pillar 1 is at risk because from the Americans' point of view, the worst of all worlds is that they don't have enough submarines. The Australians aren't spending enough in cannibalizing our own existing forces. We're not building facilities we need to actually operate and maintain the submarines that we want to buy from the Americans. And we're actually weaker now. Sorry, we're weaker in 5 years than we will be now because we're not spending enough money on defense. That is the worst of all possible worlds for the Americans. So I do think AUKUS Pillar 1 is at risk.
Well, that's really worrying. You mentioned the word cannibalizing. I take it by that you mean that the Defence Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, Richard Marles, has said that basically AUKUS is so big it's taking up 0.7% of GDP.
Yeah.
In a budget of 2%, which has been static now for the last decade at least, that means we're only spending about 1.3 on present capability. The difference, I understand, involves a rescoping of over 80 billion. It makes a farce of the Prime Minister claiming that they're upping defence spending.
Yeah.
When in effect they've rescoped in the next few years 82 billion out on the basis that no, AUKUS has to be largely funded within the existing envelope, leaving us with such critical technologies that you would have thought we'd absolutely falling over ourselves to get now. Missile defense systems, missile attack systems if we needed them, drone capability so obviously needed, the ability to do something about defending the places that might very well be attacked, even if Australia's not involved in a conflict.
Yeah. Well, Bridge Colby, the reviewer of this AUKUS report that will come out, he has suggested 3% of GDP for us. Pete Hegseth, Secretary of Defence, has suggested 3.5%. Now, those figures weren't plucked out of thin air. Those figures are based on what we ourselves say we need to do to fund AUKUS Pillar 1 and develop our existing forces to the level that we say we need under the government's own strategic defense review, Albanese's own strategic defense review. So those figures that the Americans have used, they've looked at our reports. I know that for a fact. They've looked at the Albanese government's own assessments about defense posture and concluded that you need to spend 3 to 3.5% of defense to meet the minimal needs of what you say you'll need. So from the Americans' point of view, it's, they're already struggling to produce enough submarines of their own. From their point of view, AUKUS Pillar 1, they may conclude that it is a huge expense that is overly extravagant and detrimental to both the Australian force posture and the American force posture. That is the risk if we don't spend more.
As somebody wrote the other day, and I will give them credit if I can think who it was, they made what I thought was a very sharp point. Why should Australians expect a taxpayer in Ohio to pay more for the defence of Australia than the Australian does?
Yeah. Well,
Good question for the Prime Minister.
Well, and this is why
because we do expect them to look after us. We know that.
Yeah.
80% of people think, oh, no, something goes wrong, the Americans.
Both conventionally and, by the way, also extended nuclear deterrents. We expect the Americans to somehow launch a WMD against the country that launches one against us. I mean, that's a huge expectation. Yeah. And nations don't do that unless the junior nation is valuable enough to them. And that certainly is a risk for Australia. Look, with Trump, I was always sympathetic to his view of alliances, not because I want him to break up the alliance system, but he does not have the sentimental view that just because the United States has 30 plus allies, it's automatically in a better position than its rivals like China. He has the view that you've got to look at what allies bring to the table and whether it's a net gain or a net liability for the United States. And that is harsh, but I think it's appropriate because, as you mentioned, if we expect American blood and treasure to be used for our interests, they have a right to actually ask, what do we actually bring to the table? And, these 70 years of mateship and what we've done in the past, that just doesn't matter to this administration. Look, it's uncomfortable for us, but it actually speaks to a reality of national politics. Alliances matter because they enhance the hard power of all parties.
All parties.
If it doesn't...
Which is the answer to those who say, by the way, if something goes wrong, Australia can't do anything.
Yeah.
Isolated, no.
Well, I mean, you think about options. We can actually make the alliance work, which actually means we need to do more. That's the best possible situation in terms of maximizing our hard power and protection. Or we can go it alone, which would probably cost 3-4 times more in terms of proportion GDP and defense spending than what we currently do. Or we can basically not have a defense force, right? The second option and the third option, the second option is not feasible. The third option basically means that we get dictated to.
Which was the Greens policy, by the way, in the build-up to the election.
Yeah.
No one.
The one good thing that happened in the last election was that the Greens don't hold the balance of power. I was very happy for the Labor Party from that point of view to get a majority. But look, if people like that do get their way, Australia becomes a defenseless country that can be dictated to. We went through a terrible time with China, but there were things that China couldn't do to us because of American protection. Imagine a situation where we basically had to say yes to every grievance that China issues to us. That's actually the fate of a lot of countries that don't look after themselves. It could happen to Australia if we're not careful.
That's a really interesting point, because a lot of Australians say, we shouldn't get involved in a conflict over Taiwan. If the Chinese gain that level of ascendancy in the Pacific, that list of 14 demands that they put to us when they had a dispute, we'd have no comeback, would we? That would be the outcome of it.
Yeah, and this is why
practical.
Yeah, this is why people like Paul Keating, they throw out red herrings out because they say, China doesn't tend to invade Australia. No, China doesn't, but it doesn't have to. It doesn't have to, and your national interest isn't just a sum of whether you invaded or not. So let's say China gets Taiwan. It allows a complete breakout into the Western Pacific.
Yeah.
It puts the American position in a far more precarious position. Essentially, China can do what it wants. So now imagine what this world looks like. It's not just about Chinese ships circumnavigating Australia whenever it wants. If China now says to Australia, we want to pay half the market price in iron ore, what's to stop them from imposing that? If China now says we want to buy that port or that farm or that mine or that technology, there is nothing that can actually stop the Chinese from actually doing that, right?
Well, a lot of people will say, hang on, but the government can stop them.
No, because China will now have so many coercive tools that China will make it extremely costly in a prohibitive way for Australia to say no. And by the way, this is not hypothetical. There are countries in the region that now have to put up with this. Cambodia, Laos, Thailand even to some extent. But do we want to be one of those countries that essentially cannot exercise what we would consider our basic rights of sovereignty? So it's not about being invaded. It's about being completely defenseless in the face of coercion. And that happens if we essentially allow the alliance to lapse. The alliance will lapse if we don't do our part. And of course, in the scenario where China actually takes Taiwan, that's not the beginning. Sorry, that's not the end. That's the beginning. Once China takes Taiwan, it's already told us what it's going to do. It's going to keep going. South China Sea, East China Sea, and beyond.
Now, in this scenario that we're addressing here, people who admire Trump and who do not admire Trump, if they're clear thinking, are saying one thing he's got right is he's telling everybody else to up their effort. And you look at the list of countries that are, some of them are in deep financial trouble themselves. It's quite impressive. Let's stop and think about them. Britain has stepped up and they've reformed the relationship with America despite the fact that their current Prime Minister has used all the tough language about Trump that our Prime Minister and his mates did. And they've got a relationship again. What's happening in Europe, Germany, other places like that? Well, what are they doing? Are they stepping up with their defence spending?
Yeah, they are now. I mean, well, they're now saying that they're looking to spend 3, 4, 5%, which is unthinkable. Nations can do it if that is their priority. You know, look, say in the Australian context, we could put limits on how much we spend on NDIS, but we don't. That is a government priority. We can put all sorts of limits on things if we really wanted to. I mean, we put a limit on defence. That is a government priority. It just means that the government does not consider defence as important enough to increase funding for. So from that point of view, Trump is absolutely correct that there is no such thing as this is impossible to do. It's just about government priorities. But you also have to prepare your society for it. And this is the other failing of the current Labor government, that it doesn't want to talk about geopolitics, doesn't want to talk about threats. It won't even mention the C-China word because it doesn't want to prepare the country, because it doesn't want to be put in a position where it's forced to spend more on defence rather than something else. That is a choice.
They ought to be thinking about their legacy individually. What are the people, what will their children say about them? Japan is a very interesting case in point. We keep being told about the 1930s. Well, they were literally threatening to dominate the Pacific, Greater East Asia prosperity sphere. It was a very, very dangerous time indeed. Now they're one of our most important allies, but they can't sit by idly, can they? The threat to Japan, if China dominates the region, is so massive. I can't see a circumstance where they won't move to fight with Taiwan.
No, I think the Japanese will certainly be involved in the Taiwan conflict. In fact, I think their leaders have essentially said so. But more importantly, they've actually structured their forces such that they will play a major role. And they're doing that because, as you say, their geography right next to China, if China takes Taiwan, Japan is essentially surrounded. And Japan is a country that will not accept its capacity to exercise sovereignty to be compromised in a way that it would be compromised. I am very respectful, admiring the Japanese because they have a national culture. that sees that as unacceptable and are now prepared to make the sorts of sacrifices to minimize the prospects of that terrible situation happening. Australia, I think it's less certain, where we are. There's that false comfort of geography, but we do have to ask the question, are we the same nation that we were 20, 30, 40 years ago? Are we the same nation that 10 years ago?
110 years ago.
Yeah. Are we the same nation that would reject this imposition on us and are prepared to sacrifice to prevent that from happening or not? No, that is a urgent question, it's an important question. It's a question that recent governments are afraid to ask. But it's a question you've got to ask, because if you don't have national will and resolve, you're left in a very vulnerable state.
As an aside, and it is only an aside, but I do make the point because it's a very painful one for me. In this podcasting world, I now find myself often being interviewed internationally. And particularly in America, I've noticed now the question that often comes up is, whatever happened to the pluckiness that we always associated with Australia? Why have they become so inward-looking and so timid? But that's an aside. Back to Japan. They've actually managed one way or another, despite their economic woes, their aging population, the real concerns there, and in fact the legislative limits on their capacity or their right to build an offensive force, to really make themselves quite powerful, haven't they? I mean, they've got a serious fleet of forward projecting capable warships and what have you. They are quite a force.
Yeah.
They would be quite formidable, particularly aligned with the Americans.
Yeah, I give a lot, if not almost all, of the credit to Shinzo Abe in terms of a government willing to do that. I remember when Shinzo Abe came in to government for the second time, 2012. It was preceded by a series of governments from the opposition who really didn't take geopolitics seriously. But a point being that when Shinzo Abe came in, and I'm a student of Chinese geopolitics, the Chinese were pretty confident they had neutralized Japan as a strategic factor. Japan was out of the strategic game. So Shinzo Abe comes in, and it's not just words, but he prepared his nation. He took political risks, policy risks to prepare the nation. He allocated resources accordingly. And over time, and helped by very aggressive Chinese behavior, which proved Abe right, the nation moved in a direction that Abe wanted the nation to go. And as you say now, the Japanese are undoubtedly the most important American ally in the Indo-Pacific. And the Japanese will amplify American potency and vice versa. So this has been a situation that's been created by political will, political creativity, and there is national resolve there. This hasn't happened in Australia.
It might surprise you if I say to you that Australia played a significant role in his thinking. I know that because in a way that I deeply appreciated and was quite humbled by, before he was Prime Minister there and I was Deputy Prime Minister here, we were just ministers, he for health, me for agriculture. He actually reached out to me in Tokyo, said he wanted to talk to me privately. He told me a remarkable story about how, as a young Japanese student, I think his parents had given him some money to come and tour Australia. He said the more he came here, the more he realised that the stories at home in Japan about their behaviour in the Second World War hid reality, and that perhaps his country had been less honourable than he'd been taught, and that the Allies had been more honourable. And he came to Sydney and discovered that the midget submariners who died when they attacked, got through the nets into Sydney Harbour and blew a ship up and what have you, frightened the living daylights out of everyone. They were given a military funeral. There was a big argument in Australia about the time, but they were given one. And Shinzo Abe said to me, that was the point at which I recognised the value of Western culture and why we should be part of it, because Australians behaved with courage and honour, and I hadn't been told about it. I've always remembered that story.
It's funny, you go to Japan, you hear words like courage, honor, honesty. I'm talking about society and politics. You don't hear words like identity politics and, the marginalized and victimized and so on. The point I'm making is that there's a clarity about what's confronting a nation, that they need to unite, and they need to take risks to increase their own security and prosperity. That's very different to Australia. It's very different to a lot of Western societies. That's something that the Japanese actually do have an advantage in, I think, in this kind of context.
Well, that brings me to your area of great expertise, China, and understanding China. As all of this unfolds at the moment, what do you think China's thinking? They're part of that unholy alliance now with Iran, with Russia, with North Korea, 3 of them nuclear power. The world will be safer if the 4th one doesn't become one as well. An extraordinarily transformed United States, unpredictable. What do you think they'll do? Do you buy the theory they're actually getting ready to move on Taiwan in the next 2 or 3 years?
I'd put it this way. China has undertaken the most rapid buildup of its military in peacetime history, in both absolute and relative terms, in the whole of recorded human history. Countries don't tend to do that unless they intend to use it. But even putting aside capability, you've got now a paramount leader, a dominant leader, who talks openly about preparing the country for war against Taiwan, first and foremost, and then there are other goals beyond that. You've got a Chinese political economy that's not completely, but heading towards a war footing. That is, the focus is now less on economic growth. The focus is on self-sufficiency and resilience in troubling times. That's Xi Jinping's own words. So you've got the structure, the capability, the declared intent, all heading towards the Chinese use of force. Now, nothing is inevitable. I think Xi Jinping would have felt a lot more confident a couple of years ago than he would now, because he looked around the world. There's the United States, there's Japan, there's Europe, and so on. Powerful countries, rich countries, but he didn't see the Western democracies or the American allies as countries that were willing to fight, right? And it's not just about absolute size. You look at Russia. Russia has a GDP that's barely larger than Australia's. Yet if you've got the actual national will and the resolve, you can create a hell lot of damage and overcome a lot of other countries. So 2 years ago, China felt pretty good. If you've looked at the band of allies or the axes that he had, North Korea, Iran, Russia, sure, they might be troubled economies, but they were countries that were willing to risk and fight, right? The West did not look that way. I think things have changed. A lot of credit has been given to Israel.
Yes.
Israel has not just changed the Middle East. I think it's had a global geopolitical impact in terms of the importance of hard power and willingness to use it. I credit the Trump administration, other things as well, but I credit the Trump administration with forcing Europe to become more martial and to put more money into defense. Japan was moving that way anyway. South Korea is still unclear. The new government, it's a traditional leftist government that doesn't really take geopolitics seriously. And of course, Australia, I think, has become a lot more timid. So it's a mixed balance sheet. But overall, the big powers, United States, Iran, Israel has become the regional power in the Middle East. Europe is now looking a lot more serious about these sorts of issues. That's a poorer environment for the Chinese. So if there's any optimism, it's that I think China now probably does not feel as emboldened now that it did 2 years ago. But of course, these things can change very quickly. Now, the key I should mention is Taiwan. Taiwan itself has to become a lot more of a warrior. It has to spend more money and it's got to prepare its nation, and it hasn't done that. So the Trump administration is putting a lot of effort now into forcing and coercing, cajoling Taiwan to essentially become like a prickly hedgehog that will make it less likely that China will invade.
The role of technology, yes, they've got a bigger navy now than the United States, et cetera. Yes, in some areas of technology, ASPI estimates in a rather alarming number of technologies China now leads. But conversion into practical reality is another matter. One assumes, for example, that America still clearly leads in submarine technology. One assumes that there are many other areas where I think the Israeli competence has been very impressive, but plainly American technology has been a big factor as well in their brutal effectiveness. The Chinese, I assume, would still be troubled by the sheer technological capability of the Americans.
Yeah, this is how I would assess it, both in a military and non-military sense. The Chinese are still net importers of technology. Now, despite all these reports about them leading in lots of areas, they're still a net importer in the key technologies. Where they are ahead is in production. So the Americans in the West might be ahead in technology, but the Chinese are ahead in production. And they have a surge capacity to produce more and more things that you might need in war, or peacetime for that matter. So think about, World War I, World War II. The Americans weren't necessarily ahead in technology, but they had enormous dominance in industrial capability. And when it came down to it, it was that industrial capability that allowed the Americans to prevail. If you look at Russia and China, what makes them so formidable is that they've got military supply chains entrenched in their economies. So they might have lots of economic and structural problems as economies and nations. But the one thing they can do is that they set up to fight wars. So that's the problem with the West. It's about production and supply chains. We have no surge capacity. The Chinese, the Chinese, just say in shipping, both civilian and military, they can produce more ships each year than the rest of the world combined. So it's not the technology to have the advantage in; it's the surge industrial capacity. And look, part of the Trump administration's reindustrialization campaign. And I'm not arguing tariffs are the best way of achieving that, but the point is American reindustrialization is very important for America and the rest of the world, the rest of the democratic world.
Looking a little further ahead, assuming that we can get through the next few years, both America, well, all of the West, and China face big problems, but I wonder whether China's aren't more severe. They're the demographic time bomb. They're even more worrying debt levels, alarming than America's in the West. The inherent problems with the command economy that they're essentially overseeing again, making themselves unattractive for investment and for top quality thinkers and what have you, versus America now making certain they've got cheap energy. That's going to be very important for security as well as economic growth, and the two are tied. They're still the home, I would have thought, for clear thinkers, innovators, what have you. How do you think it might play out over the next few years? President Xi is 71. He's probably got quite a few years left in him. Or is the situation actually unstable? Perhaps we don't know. But what's your read on the relative trajectories of the two economies and their ability to fund, if you like, conflict?
Well, at a structural level, I think the United States economy is far healthier and in a far better position than China's for all the reasons that you mentioned, which is the reason why I have all of my superannuation funds in American dollars, not in Chinese RMB. But the problem is that the problem with Xi in the next 10 years right? I mean, Xi has put himself in a position where he has to achieve what he has promised, his China dream, unification of Taiwan, Chinese dominance in Asia. If he doesn't achieve that, my assessment is that he is in trouble, firstly, and existentially. Like, he has created a hell of enemies inside the system. So my worry is that over the next 10 years or so, you've got a Chinese leader whose personal interest in pushing the envelope, in taking risks, is now not well aligned with the sort of inbuilt structural moderators within the Chinese system because of the problems that you mentioned that China has. And so who knows whether Xi will succeed, but the point is that if he pushes the button on things, pushes the envelope, regardless of whether he succeeds, he creates a hell lot of disruption and problems and destruction for the rest of us. That's what I'm worried about. So if you ask me, what is the basic game plan? The basic game plan is to have enough credible hard power and resolve to prevent Xi from thinking that he can succeed over the next 5-10 years.
Would his military tell him the truth, or is he so surrounded himself with henchmen that he won't listen? If they say to him, actually, no, they've still got technology we can't hope to overcome, we shouldn't go now, would he listen?
I don't think they tell him the truth, because if you think about the system he's created, it's not great for your career or maybe your personal freedom if you start telling him that things aren't working or you say the word no. And it's quite significant that when the Russians first invaded Ukraine, and the global expectations Ukraine would fall within a week, but the Russian military clearly wasn't as effective as everyone thought. Very shortly after, Xi did a audit of his rocket force and his navy. And they're the two important parts of the military because they're the ones that will be used to invade Taiwan. And a lot of the major generals were sacked and replaced. A lot of the senior officers were sacked and replaced. Now, I'm speculating, but that tells me that he did an audit of the true capabilities and worked out that a combination of corruption, of military people not telling him the truth, there were gaps in the PLA progress that he hadn't been told about, and he became very angry about it. So I suppose if that's correct, that's a good thing. But, with these sorts of systems, it's very difficult for subordinates to tell the top guy the truth. I mean, the same thing happened with Putin as well. But of course, if they actually decide to launch a military action, even if they've overestimated the capabilities, as we've seen in Ukraine, it creates a lot of destruction. So we don't want them to do that in the first place.
We certainly do not. And thank you for your contribution in unpacking all of this for us. Policymakers need to listen to people who know what they're talking about. No one better than you.
Well, John, it's always an honor to be on your podcast, and thank you for having me.
Thank you.